Happy Halloween season, spooky season beginning times. I was re-listening to a favorite episode of mine from one of my favorite podcasts of all time, Blank Check with Griffin and David. They were talking about John Carpenter's 1978 classic Halloween.
Just like if I tomorrow was like, I'm going to make a movie called, Arbor Day, what's the plot? A guy kills some people.
Right.
He gets out of prison and he kills some people.
Yeah.
People would be like, I'm excited to see that.
Yes.
That's the kind of movie I like to see.
Yeah. Maybe one of the greatest first hours of a podcast. This is a 3-hour episode. I implore everyone to listen to this episode, but specifically this first hour, the guest, Alex Ross Perry, who's behind one of my favorite films of this year, Pavements, the collage film, biopic, documentary, combo feature about the band Pavement, Stephen Malkmus' Pavement, Show Me a Word That Rhymes with Pavement, and some words that aren't particularly YouTube friendly. But he basically goes on an extended dissertation about how we get Halloween and the cultural context and circumstances to get what Bruce Campbell calls the Cadillac of slashers.
It is almost impossible to watch it and be like, oh, I understand why this movie is I understand why this is still the slasher movie against which all others are measured. Because you look at it and you're like, this is just like a good movie. How can you possibly understand what a big deal this movie was?
Sure.
This movie that cost nothing. This movie that has no production value beyond its Steadicam and its music. How can you explain to somebody, even someone who loves the movie and loves Carpenter, this is the 10-year runway that this movie landed on. And
sure.
Now 40 years later, you can just copy Halloween and still make a pretty good movie. Why is that?
Right. You could start from the beginning of time. Horror is one of the first genres that's really experimented in silent film, like Trip to the Moon, that's science fiction. But then you get the Germans, German Expressionism, Dr. Caligari, or the original Nosferatu, F.M. Murnau's. F.W. Murnau, F.M. Murnau, F.W. Murnau. Horror goes back, but it progresses in a lot of ways. I think Gothic horror is the first main proliferation of it, while having different threads and subcategories therein. Universal is making their name, making their claim with monsters. And that basically colors the generalized public idea of what horror is. And it was accomplishing its tasks of scare. But eventually the Universal monster films kind of start to become out of vogue. There seems to be a fork in the road here. Studios, big and small, still trying to ape the Universal model, but with, I think, cheaper effects, while still being, I think, about effects. They're effects-driven films that don't have the greatest amount of substance beyond that. Things that get into Mystery Science Theater territories. The creature features that end up regulars at 50s drive-in culture. Movies to make out to. But at the other side, the other fork in the road, across the pond, England's Hammer Horror, Hammer Productions, decides also to ape Universal's model to the extent that let's make handsome versions. Let's make versions that kind of apply to our time. They're movies that are sophisticated, that are thematically modern in nature, but that don't remove the onus of special effects. They double down, they make it look as sophisticated as their plots. Let's make The Mummy look like this. But where does it full turn, 360 turn, 180 turn, at least domestically? I think it's Psycho. Psycho's a movie that I love intensely. It's been parodied millions of times, decades, eons. That specific movie works because it's a Hitchcock film first and foremost. It follows the tenor and the structure and the tone and everything about what he usually does with the added oomph of a slasher, with the added oomph of a horror. It's a slasher by technicality, it does everything a slasher would do, but there's much more below the hood there. Psycho is the first inkling too of horror being found in a much more real place. The creature features did that here and there, The Blob, The Thing from Another World. These are films where you start to see contemporary characters, but I don't think it's not knocking at your door. It's kind of outsized. It's over there. And Psycho is the case of really getting to know a character first, getting to know them intimately and their struggles. And even though it's them walking into the situation, there's a sanctity here. There's a sanctity to driving on the open road. Stopping at Bates Motel is an eerification of something that ultimately is benign. And the house is just as much the monster, maybe more the monster than Norman Bates is. Norman Bates is a casualty to situation that's befallen him, the way that he was raised. A lot of gross conclusions there. I mean, you look back on the original trailer for Psycho, which is just Hitchcock walking around the set on the Universal backlot, like, here's the hill, here's the motel, here's the bed, here are the stairs. I like to film stairs. It's showing that the intrigue is how we're coloring it more than a more obvious way at a scare. And I think that only begins an upward momentum slope of everyday horror, what would end up being domestic horror, which is kind of the main function of this video. Sorry to give you a drive my car style 40 minutes in kind of title card, but there it is. That's what this video is about. It's domestic horror. Because that seems to be just a really interesting trend. You have horror revitalized by the way that it's treating the American family. The American family going into the 60s is the most precious thing in the world, not to mention family traditions, religion, politics, all of these things. These are sensitivities to the people. Dracula isn't going to come knocking at their door. Instead, what if we said it was Satan? Instead, what if we said it was one of his emissaries? Instead, what if it were a deranged individual, a psycho killer? Instead, what if it were your next door neighbor? I mean, in his essay, The Ideas of Apocalypse, film critic Christopher Sherritt talked about how, like, you know, if Psycho is kind of maybe about the validity of American civilization, then in a society concurrent or post-Watergate, Vietnam, that classical ideals of domesticity, contemporary living, was to be not only critiqued, but to kind of be turned on its head, to usher in the American Gothic, underscored by absurdity. And again, these are the foundation of films that are not just successful, I suppose, monetarily with the viewing public, but these were well done to a degree that so many of these had award buzz. These were films that made horror viable for studios to see as, like, we can put big stars behind them. We can put this and that, the pitter the pat. Because people like them and it's making a lot of money, we can put more money behind them. Such as it were, Alex Ross Perry proposes a Mount Rushmore of domestic horror, consisting of Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, The Omen, and Amityville Horror. There's definitely a spiderweb of connection here. Rosemary, The Omen, and The Exorcist are all about Satan's spawn, or Satan targeting children. Rosemary's Baby being from the perspective of the mother, The Omen being from the perspective of the father, with a son in actuality and corporeal form, a real physicalized, unbenevolent character. And of course, The Exorcist, a bastardization, a possession of a well-meaning daughter of repute, so to speak. The Amityville Horror is the only one, as Griffin Newman will suggest in the same podcast episode, that it's much more abstracted, which is why it has a million different direct-to-video sequels, because its world building is a lot more open-ended. You can infer a lot of different things about the nature of the Amityville Horror, the Amityville house, interpretations of what an Amityville Horror is. I mean, the Omen is too sophisticated to be abstracted. The Exorcist can't be abstracted, but it can be, like, cheapened, and that has historically had diminishing returns. And you can't really touch Rosemary's Baby. What can you add or subtract to Rosemary's Baby to make it more relevant? I think it stands the same amount of relevance here and now about female autonomy. And also, like, just the nature of marriage hasn't changed so dramatically. And I don't know what supernaturally you would add to it. I don't know what a Rosemary's Baby's Day Out looks like. Rosemary's Baby 2, Look Who's Talking Now. What is that? Rosemary's Baby presents a world defined by paranoia, defined by trust or lack thereof. The titular Rosemary, played by Mia Farrow, is implicitly trusting of everyone around her, including especially her husband, played by John Cassavetes, whose name is escaping me. The character name is escaping me. John Cassavetes plays a fairly unassuming, normal man, and simultaneously one of cinema's biggest monsters. Of performative, that word's being tossed around a lot, but truly performative goodness, of projecting a good vibe whilst committing atrocity and just hoping that that appearance obfuscates all. Such as we see in real life with the worst pervert offenders of the last decade or so. The Omen, while less grounded in reality, observes the same kind of paranoia, a world of bad luck, charms, and curses, broken mirrors and fallen ladders to the nth degree, the most extreme and gory apparitions and presuppositions, and the distance he feels from his son Damien, who is also the spawn of Satan. If it wasn't clear, Rosemary is carrying Satan's seed, so that's a whole thing. And in the case of all these, where you have all these reboots and stuff, we just talked about it, First Omen was really good. I want to just put it out there right now. First Omen, really good, really gross. The Omen is an investigation film. The onus is on Gregory Peck, even though the problem isn't or cannot be solved so simply. The Exorcist is grounded in religion, on these sort of classical dogmas associated with the Catholic faith, but equally has a lot to do with the relationship of parent and child. And similar to The Omen, but I think much more pointedly, is about the lack of control there. There's an emotional rendering that you don't really find in Damien, because Damien is that way. The Exorcist is workable, hence the title. We can call it an exorcist. But it's in the mere possibility that I think that's where the fear lies. And Amityville Horror is about the home. It's about the physicalized home and the things happening there. And it's definitely the most, quote-unquote, supernatural of them all. You mix all this into a boiling cauldron and you get the prevailing terrors of the late 60s and predominant 70s. But tangential to all this is the creature feature birthing into a slew of independent exploitation film. Across the pond, you get Italian giallo, you get the William Castle gimmick film, and then eventually the Roger Corman gimmick film. You get the Roger Corman, it's exploitation. Sometimes it's softcore, But in that soup, you're getting the first hints of slasher. You get films like Mario Bava's Black Sunday, or you get also Mario Bava, A Blood and Black Lace. You get Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, and I think the most influential of all, Night of the Living Dead, George Romero. George Romero being like the first real horror auteur, an auteur to be specialized in horror. And so you have domestic horror, which is locking into this world of the real, and you get the slasher, which it's a far cry from monster horror, but it's still about running, it's still about its obvious killings. And somewhere in the middle, you get Texas Chainsaw, which is not about an attack on the family, but a reframing of the entire premise. That what if the family itself was the monster?
Texas Chainsaw Massacre takes place nowhere. You don't need to be afraid of that happening to you unless you happen to be...
Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you are definitely like, why don't these kids maybe hang a left and hit the highway?
There's that turn back,
if your car breaks down in the middle of nowhere, you're in danger. This does not bring the threat into your home.
Tobe Hooper tried to get that movie a PG rating. He was shooting for a PG rating, okay? It's lucky that it got an R. Let's be really, really real with ourselves. Its masthead was Leatherface, and from Leatherface begot the model of the horror icon character. And the next one in succession would be Michael Myers. And though not the nexus, Halloween provides the thrust, the perfection of all of these things at play in Texas Chainsaw and all the things at play in Rosemary, Omen, and all this stuff into one singular shape, capital S shape, who then leads a franchise, which is a whole different space of horror, but offers this perfect meat of externalized, otherized, separate entity encroaching in upon space, hopeful enough to be escaped from, but powerful enough to keep coming back. And that perhaps presents the most streamlined vision, which has yet to have been completely disproven, even as the elevated horror era dominates. The same practical structure continues to exist and subsist in the circumstances of both nostalgia, but also culturally, recursivity. Domestic horror is, I think, the most interesting era. Those four films are some of the most interesting films that defined their time. I don't think we've had such a perfect definition of era swath of films ever, especially in the horror genre, now or since. I loved Eddington and One Battle After Another, but they only capture a fraction of the greater chaos that the 2020s wreak. And maybe that's just the case, that there's too much to encapsulate these days, whereas the 70s, Watergate and Vietnam. All this being said, as we look towards all these great movies that we want to watch the entire spooky season, it's our one time to get creepy. Looking to the context is really fun, really important, and offers a greater understanding as to why we don't make movies like that anymore, but also like what makes horror horror. Why is something scary? And it's always going, the answer is always going to be context. Thank you for watching Turner Classic Companion, your one-stop shop for what plays on TCM, the Criterion Channel, and wherever you find amazing classic films. One of these sides has a video to watch. Watch it, please. If you like this video about horror, there's more where it came from, folks. We're gonna stay in the shadows for a bit. Staying in the shadows. Thank you.